Okay. So welcome to those that are here, and then welcome to those that are going to watch this online. Basically, tonight was inspired by a whole bunch of different things. So one of them was Leah, who's on the call, asked me about how I do yearly plans last year. She just finished her comp dev, had gone through the courses, and was like, how do I actually apply this to everyday life? And I thought this would be a great webinar, right? Because what you learn in the courses and how you figure out how to do things on your own is completely different. So I am going to basically give you an approach of how I do a yearly plan, and then I'll bring in some tips and tricks of how others might approach this a little bit differently than I do. And if you guys have any questions as we go through this, or if you want to jump in because you're like, oh, hey, I do this way and you do this way, then that's the whole purpose of tonight, right? It's to share ideas. For the Alberta people on the call, I will be doing more webinars throughout the year. I will not be presenting them. I'll be bringing in guest speakers, but the topic or the overall theme of this year's webinars will be around coaching. So all kinds of topics. If there's something that you want to learn, please let me know. But this is the time of year when I'm doing all of my athlete plans. And so I'll share sort of how I get started. So this is the template, or part of the template. I'll be sharing the whole thing with you over the course of the next 54 minutes. But this is sort of how I get started. So when I bring in a new athlete, I basically look through their training peaks and I get an idea of the type of volume that they've done in the past. So my yearly plan, this is the top half of it that you're seeing now. So my season starts basically the first week of October, the last week of September. The reason is most of my athletes are racing up until this time. They're racing at World Championships. But depending on the athlete that you have, your season might go September to September or July to July. However, you work in your season and how your athletes basically when their seasons are. It might go November to November. But I go from basically the last week of September or first week of October and then rotate through the year that way. So the numbers that I'm sharing with you, or the data that I'm sharing with you, is from a collection of all kinds of different athletes that I coach. So it's not specific to one person. I'm also not going to be sharing whose information I'm sharing. So it's really just here to be used as a guide. So this is an example of someone I'll be coaching them for the first time this year. I've gone through their training peaks, and basically I start with their yearly volume. Right. So in this case, I've gone back to 2021. This athlete was a U17. The way they progressed through juniors, the way they progressed through U23. And then as I go through their training peaks, I will make a note of certain information. So I use orange as sickness or mistraining for whatever reason. Yellow means there's something in that week that I want to go back and look at, or it might also just be something that's high volume. An example of where I find this really useful is if I'm working with a junior athlete or like a Cat 4 athlete, where they might do 8 hours of training every week, and then all of a sudden there's a 23-hour week in there. I'm like, oh, wait, what happened there? So I use yellow just to highlight. I need to go back in and look at what they did. And if it's something like a junior, I'll look at that information and be like, okay, how did they react to that week, right? When they did a 22-hour week and they're normally doing an 8-hour week, does that mean that I can up their volume a little bit? Can I put extra volume in over the course of the year? How does all that work? And then if we scroll over to the other side of my sheet, you'll see these green notes. These green notes are basically when the athlete was feeling amazing, right? So this is someone, I sent them a survey. In the survey, they responded back that these were the weeks where they felt the best, or where they felt the strongest, or where they had the best performances. For the athletes that I've coached for several years, you'll see green all throughout this document, right? And what I'm looking for, the reason I track this, is that what I'm looking for are patterns, right? Are there patterns to the orange, right? Are there patterns to their sickness? So as an example, people that are in school, it's usually likely that they get sick when the season's over and they go back to school. They might get sick again in February when it's flu season. So I'm sort of looking through those patterns, and then I can figure out, okay, this happens every year, so I need to plan for that to happen. Same thing with the greens. So a lot of my athletes this year that I've been coaching for a bit, they had greens in March and April. They felt the best in March and April, right? So then the discussion is, okay, well, why didn't you feel great again in August and September? So for some of them, it's the season was just long, the races kicked in. So they felt really good coming off of a good training block, but then with all the races that were happening, they just never felt that they got the benefit from the training. They were just racing and riding, I call it defensively, right? Or some of them, it might be that they had a crash or they had some injuries that they had to get rid of. I don't think athletes should ever be injured. So it's also something that you want to track, right? If they have a history of injuries, why is that happening and how can we fix it? I think I have a pretty good track record as a coach of having injury-free athletes outside of crashes. But then if you go over to the end, this is where I sort of keep track of all of that data, right? So we'll see these are the volume of hours that they did in the year. So in this case, the athlete did 444 athletes as a U17. Then he upped it by 28% the following year, then 16%, kept it kind of the same, but the intensity went up. I know that from looking through his training peaks. And then last year, his volume went up again, another 12%. So I know that last year he did 856 hours. And then if we look up at the top, this is sort of my forecasting for this next year, right? So if we increase his volume by 10%, what does that look like in terms of hours? 15% takes him to 984 hours, 20% takes him to that 1,000-hour mark, right? And since I have Kevin on here, and I know that he knows this answer, as a U23 second-year athlete, roughly how many hours do you think they should be doing in order to be competitive on the world stage?
That number is changing.
Yeah.
I used to say that by the end of U23, so I would say that like 1,000 hours is kind of the benchmark to work towards, but not every athlete ultimately is going to be able to do 1,000 hours, or 1,000 hours may not be the best for them. But as a young developing athlete, you want to try to work towards that 1,000 hours by the end of U23, so third or fourth year. But now I think it's shifting down to like second or third year, just based on how the sport is changing globally and how athletes are developing a little bit sooner and whatnot. But so the goal should be to try to work towards it, but also understand when the athlete has reached their personal threshold and sort of back them off from that, because it may not be appropriate for them to be training that much.
Thank you. Kevin did a podcast with Clipless in Canada that talks about all kinds of numbers like this, which is why I called on you, because it was great. But if you want to learn more of that kind of data, I encourage you to listen to that podcast. It's also the reason that I go back in history, right? Because to Kevin's point, if we went from 700 hours to 1,000 hours, it's a massive jump, right? And it's really important that you look at what the history of that athlete is to understand, A, if they can handle that kind of volume, B, if they should, and C, what does that look like, right? I'm going to talk about intensity and stuff here in a second, but this is basically where I start. I want to get a good snapshot of what the athlete has done in the past. The other thing that I look at is I look at their progress in terms of wattage. We are a sport of numbers. Wattage is a number that we can kind of use to forecast different things, right? So in this case, we can see that in 2024, these are the numbers that the athlete did in 2024. Pardon me. These are the numbers that the athlete did in 2025. These are their best of the season. They're not all from tests. Some of them are from races or training. And then if you look up at the green, this is the improvements or lack of improvements, right? In this case, this athlete improved across the board. That's not always the case. I'm also going to preface this by saying that looking at numbers in a static medium like this one, right? Where let's say we're looking at, okay, they improved 8.75% on their 10-minute power, right? That's great. But was that a tested environment? Was that a race environment? Was that under fatigue? Was it a race scenario? Where did that number actually come from? So even though I do keep track of progress and improvements, I don't think that this number is deserves 100% of the weight, right? So as an example, I had an athlete last year who had a phenomenal season and her numbers basically stayed the same. However, what she was capable of doing for 10 minutes, she could do it in the second hour of racing. She could repeat it in the third hour of racing, and then she could repeat it in the fourth hour of racing, right? So how you're analyzing the data and how you're choosing to keep track of it is really important. And I'm happy to talk to anybody about this stuff. I can talk for hours about all of this. 24/7 is really how I like to talk all the time about this kind of stuff. And if I don't know the answer, then by all means, we'll bring in other people that have answers or different opinions or other perspectives. The other bit that I use in terms of looking at what an athlete needs to train is where they want to be, right? So if we look over at this table over here, yeah, make this smaller. So basically, this is just a Google search will give you these numbers, right? So DP stands for Domestic Pro, World Tour or WT stands for World Tour. So in the case of this, in case of a domestic pro, they should be able to do about 21.59 watts per kilo for a 5-second effort. For this athlete, that translates to 1619 watts, which means that they're 85% of that target, right? So the percentage is how close are they to meeting the target in order to be a domestic pro, right? So they're 90%, they have 10% to go, if you will, in order to be at a domestic pro level. For their 5-minute, and then you have their 10-minute, their 20-minute. And then same thing, I did the same thing for the World Tour, right? So I basically look at these numbers and I'm like, okay, realistically, how much can we improve every year? If the goal of an athlete is to be World Tour or domestic pro, you can even do this for national level, Cat 1, Cat 3, Cat 4, right? You can find all these numbers online. It's just an easy Google search. You can find where your athlete wants to be in 2 or 3 years. And then I build the plan around that, right? So it's like, okay, if I think we can improve 10% here and 5% there, what does that look like? When in the season does that need to happen? Is this even a realistic ask of this athlete, right? So if I had an athlete that was at 50% numbers for a world tour level, and they're like, I want to be world tour, get a pro contract in 2 years, then that's a discussion that you also need to have, right? So these numbers also work well in those discussions where coming up with realistic goals and expectations is super important. Whoops. Okay. So then what I do is I build out the year in terms of hours, right? So for this athlete, I've decided a 9% improvement in terms of volume or 9% increase in terms of volume is going to be helpful. This is also reflecting that I know that we need to increase the intensity in certain things, right? So you increase the volume or you increase the intensity, but you can only do both so much so fast. So we're going with a 9% on this one. The blues are where I've put recovery weeks in. But I've basically built out their hours per week for the whole year, knowing that that is all going to completely change, right? It'll change because of sickness, school, vacation, family commitment, illness, motivation. Maybe we misgauged a training phase and therefore we need to take a break. All kinds of things, life stresses, right? There's all kinds of things that change us. Or I have an athlete who just likes to add 10% every week. So I just know to factor that into their plan because I know they're going to do more than what I've written in. I think you talk about that in that podcast as well, Kevin, the adding. Anyway. So I build in the volume for the year in terms of hours. I build in where I think the recovery weeks are going to fall so that I can then build in my phases. So if you've done a coaching course, these phases are giving terms like strength, endurance, speed, anaerobic power, all those kinds of words. I generally just put in what I think we need to work on. So I've been coaching now since 1992 was when I took my first coaching course. So it's been a while. Coaching and the way it's taught is changed a lot. And part of the way I do things is because there's certain stuff that I just know and take for granted, right? I just know it. It's in my DNA now. I've been doing this so long. So I would encourage coaches who are just starting out in this process to stick a little bit to the terms that you've been taught in your courses and that they use in literature. It just helps you understand the building blocks that you need, right? So there are certain things you need to start with in order to build on top of. And I would argue starting with strength and making sure your body knows how to move is one of the pillars that you need to build off of. So for this athlete, right, I've given them a 6-week phase where we're going to work on strength. So we'll be introducing the gym back in, and then I've written in what that looks like on the bike, right? So in this case, it's low cadence stuff. It's efforts that are 10 to 12 minutes. And then we're going to do some pickups in there. And the reason for the pickups for this athlete is that they'll be racing come February, or they're a track athlete and need to keep some of that speed in their legs and some of that cadence in their legs, right? Then they're going to work on to what I call anaerobic fun, which is basically fatigued sprints. I've written in there what those workouts look like, right? So rather than explaining what the phase is, I've written in what I think the workouts need to be. And then ugly over unders, which are my absolute favorite. It's usually the phase where I get phone calls halfway through a workout. Athletes are questioning their reason for living. But it's basically longer sustained efforts. And then depending on the athlete, what we need to target. So in this case, this athlete needs to be able to do 500 watts for more than 2 minutes. They need to be able to do that fatigued over the course of a long ride. And then I've built in February, where we're going to focus on some race climbs, some attacks, some race scenarios. What's important too, and I think that this step should come before the phases. So sorry, I glanced over that, but putting in the events. So if you know what races they're going to do, if you know when their camps are, if you know when they're going to be off for vacation, if you know they're going to be having a really heavy exam season, I would put that in the events as well. So again, this is just a mock-up of a yearly plan. It's not a real yearly plan. But in this case, the athlete's training for road nationals. They have these other races that we know of so far. We know their team camp is going to be happening this week. If we know there's going to be vacation in there. A lot of my athletes are high-level U23s. So I do put in off weeks in the course of the season. I like having 3 of them. It's hard to get 3 in once the race season starts, but I do program them in so they're at least on the radar, and it helps prevent burnout because they race from February until October. But yeah, so you want to put all the events. If you do testing, like if 20-minute FTPs is something that you do, or you have a different kind of test, I would also write that in the events. Yeah, and then with an understanding of how you plan to use that data. Okay, any questions so far? Perfect. I'll keep motoring along. The other thing that is really important, and I send this out to the athletes to fill in, is what their goals are, right? I kind of glanced over that. I apologize. I am going a bit out of order. But I have a form that's basically their key performance index or performance profiling, whatever you want to call it. Make up something that makes sense to you. I fill out one of these and I have the athlete fill out one of these, right? So it's basically you're listing what their strengths are and what they think they need to improve on. Hopefully you line up. Sometimes you discover that you don't, which is also why it's important, I think, for the athlete to fill it out as well as the coach independently, and then to come together and come up with a plan. So in this case, I have technical aspects. I have tactical. Technical would be things like, I don't know, gear choices, cadence, fitness, right? Do you need to work on your 1-minute power? Do you need to work on your 60-minute power? Endurance. Tactics, this would be things like race strategy, right? Do you know how to win in a sprint finish? Are you capable of racing in a peloton? Do you know how to read a route, understand the direction of the wind, that kind of stuff? Physical could be interpreted any way you want as well, right? So again, that might be going back to the endurance or the anaerobic, or do you need to work on more improved muscle strength? Do you have weaknesses in there? Are you prone to injury? I spend a lot of time with my athletes on the mental side of things, right? So that's goal setting, race planning, visualization, confidence building, yeah, all kinds of stuff. So that's in there. Lifestyle could be things like sleep habits, sleep routines, life off the bike, nutrition. And then you might want to you can make up your own categories, right? So you might choose to make fueling a whole category on its own. What's the knowledge like on fueling? Are you fueling enough in the race, off the bike? Do you know how to cook? Have you ever been to a grocery store? All that kind of stuff. So I'll take the data gained from the form that the athlete fills in and the form that I fill in, as well as past race experience. I'll also ask them what their goals are. And then that will also help lead the phases and the type of training that you do. Right. So I like to have this written in the yearly plan so that we don't forget about it. But in this case, this athlete, their achievement goal or their results-based goal is to win nationals, the time trial at nationals. It's a U23 woman who wants to go to Montreal, just saying. But then it's also really important to understand what you need to do to achieve that, right? So if your goal is to win at nationals, well, what does that actually mean? Right? It means you need to be comfortable on your time trial bike in the aero position. You need to understand the race, the route, the demands of that. In this case, it's been identified that you need to be able to hold 300 watts for 30 minutes, right? So I think that most of our time as coaches should be spent on process goals, because that really determines the phases that you want to do and how you want to approach them, right? And if the athlete only understands that, oh, I want to win this race, but has no idea how to win the race, right, then it's a problem. So if they want to win a race that's going to come down to a sprint finish, that was the goal of the second athlete that we've put in here, right? They need to understand how to surf the groups. How do you maneuver sprint trains? Do you even know when you should sprint? How long is your sprint? When's the latest you can go? What kind of landmarks are you looking for? Can you even get to the sprint finish? Do you have the endurance and the fitness to be at the finish in order to even contest the win? And then I've put something else in here, which I wasn't quite sure who was going to show up, but for people that are coaching or even athletes that are going to listen to this who do want to join a team at some point, getting a pro contract is a really important goal to have on your list, and understanding stuff that you need to do to get there, right? Do you have a resume? Do you even know who to reach out to? Coming up with a plan to build that part is super important. Okay. So coming back to my yearly plan, now that I've collected all this data of what the strengths are, what we need to work on, what races they're going to do, what those races look like, right, that will help determine my training phases. I have only done this to March. So most of the athletes that I work with, come March, April, they're in team camps, races have started, and the season just gets flipped on its head. So I used to put phases in for the whole year. Now I just build it out until February. And then once they do their first race, we revisit what they need to do for the remainder of the year. Because once they've done the race, we'll see sort of where they sit. If I was coaching a provincial level athlete, I would definitely fill in all of my phases for the year. That doesn't mean they won't change or need to be shifted, but I do think it's really important for the newer coaches to get into the practice of building out the whole year, right? How do you actually, each of these phases I think of as building blocks. You need to do one before you move to the next one, whether it's you need to have enough strength to handle the anaerobic stuff, or you need to have enough fitness to handle the fatigued efforts. it's really important that these training phases, however you want to label them and describe them, they are building blocks. So it's important that the athlete can handle mentally and physically the one coming up because of what's come before that. If I was doing a yearly plan for a group, let's say I was coaching a group of athletes like Burr, you might be doing in Edmonton on the velodrome, I would actually still do a yearly plan. So I might not put all the hours in there because we know the hours are consistent and steady, but I would still have the training phases in there. I would put in the events, I would put in the recovery weeks. So whether I'm doing a group or an individual, this would all still pretty much look the same. The other thing I would add in is if I had an athlete who, let's say they were skier in the wintertime and then they cycled in the summertime, I would actually include their winter training, right? So I would factor in the number of hours that they spent, because that also tells me, okay, where can I start in my season? Do I have to start with like base and reintroduction into cycling, or do they have enough fitness and strength and everything that we can kind of skip a few steps and start them a little bit farther along in the process? So I know a lot of Alberta coaches are coaching multi-sport athletes, and I think there needs to be weight into the sport they do outside of cycling. It counts. You're building an engine, you're building strength, you're building an overall athlete. But yeah, so now we've got all this information and all this data. So then this is where I go into my purple rows. So these are my purple rows. They're called purple rows because I label them purple. There's nothing scientific about it at all. I thought I added in, sorry. Oh, I did on this one. Okay, so purple rows, they differ for each athlete. Oops. But basically, the definition of my purple rows is everything outside of training hours and workouts. So all the other stuff, right? So in this case, this athlete has however many purple rows, right? But they line up with the KPIs or with the key performance indicators. So they have tactical skills that we want to work on each phase, technical skills, mental skills, equipment stuff. For this athlete, I have fueling in here. I think fueling is something we need to talk about a lot. There's strength in here. Happy stuff, I'll explain what I mean by that in a bit. This athlete, we've identified they need to improve their sleep patterns, right? They're not a good sleeper for a whole bunch of reasons. So they have a purple cell called sleep. Something else that you might want to put in here is, oh my God, it's gone. Anyway, it's basically everything that happens outside of the bike, right? But you can change them, make them something that means something to you and means something to the athlete, right? It's usually something that's come up in the key performance indicators. You might have one in here that's just stress and anxiety, right? If you have an athlete that like suffers from stress and anxiety, maybe that becomes one of the purple rows. What are some of the stuff that we're going to pull in so that we can help them stay calm? They can help manage their time. They can deal with the chaos that's happening at home. We'll put some stuff in to help with that, right? But then each phase, I put stuff in that the athlete needs to work on, right? Is that big enough for you guys to read? Yeah, okay. Bear with me here. So I put in some examples of what this might look like for each thing. But again, this is something else that I would build this out for a good chunk of the year because they build on each thing, right? So for some of the technical skills like smooth pedal stroke, using your gears, understanding how to use your brakes, moving into RPMs, there's some skills that kind of build on each other, right? So if it's something where you need to be able to be good at this before you can be good at that, then that's another reason why it's really important to write this in. I also started doing these in my yearly plans because I realized I would forget about them, right? The season comes and you're so focused on race stuff that you forget, oh yeah, I need to make sure this athlete knows how to, that they can drink on the bike, that they can do hand signals, that they understand how to corner at speed. All kinds of stuff that's super important, right? For young athletes, equipment. Maybe they don't know that they should be checking their tires. How do you know when you need to replace your tire? How do you know when you need to replace your chain? Is this an athlete that should learn how to bleed their own brakes, right? Can they check their rotors? So basically, you look at your athlete and understand, have the conversation of where they're at. What do they know how to do? What do they need to be able to know how to do in order to achieve their goals for where they want to get later in the year? I'm going to touch on the strength one here. So the strength should line up with your training phase, right? So if we look at this first block, once we scroll up, right, this is the strength phase. We're doing strength stuff on the bike. So once we get down to the purple row, what they're doing in the gym lines up with what they're doing on the bike, right? Same thing, the next phase adds in a bit more strength. So we're going to add in a bit more power. We're going to add in maybe some jumping. And then as the season gets on, we take some of the weight off, but we move more towards the smaller muscles for support. So when you're building out, again, what I call the purple rows, I'm sure there's a scientific name for it. You're basically looking at your building blocks and making sure that you're not skipping a building block for the athlete or the group of athletes that you're working with. Happy stuffs. Happy stuffs, or what I call human time, are things that the athlete needs in order to stay happy. What's important to them, right? When the season comes, or like if it's school all the time and training all the time, they don't have time for their friends, but friends is an important part of helping them feel happy. What are some things that are being put in order to make sure that they stay happy, right? A perfect example is you have a junior team, all the guys get along, and the next year they all go to a different team, right? So that might be something where the goal is to set up a Zoom call every Saturday at the same time for these guys to get together, meet up, hang out, find out what's going on, create a support group, right? Or it might be that, okay, in the month of December, you're going to plan something every Saturday, right? You're going to do something, you're going to go to a Christmas market, or you're going to go for a hike. Maybe a hike is what brings you happy, right? So, yeah, I think that happy element is super important. My rule number one as a coach is athletes need to be happy and healthy. Okay. So now we've discovered our purples. We've added in stuff in our purples, right? So based off of the conversations that you have with an athlete, what they've written in, maybe you have surveys or forms, stuff that they're writing in their training logs, all of that stuff. And this will constantly be updated too, right? My yearly plans are a living document. They change all the time. So the last part of my yearly plan is monitoring. So going back to where we started, right? I've put in my planned hours. In this case, we're going to focus on this kind of yellowy, beigey section. Every week I go in and I keep track of what we actually did, right? So even though I've planned out the year with my hours, I plan the hours, but then the hours changed on what I wrote in for a variety of reasons, right? A good example is this time of year. If the weather's nice, I'm going to up their hours. If it's snowing, I'm going to decrease their hours from the plan, right? Or change to multi-sport, right? Go hiking, go snowshoeing, go skiing, go play hockey, something. So I keep track of the actual planned hours that I write in each phase. And I know that this is just an example, right? So obviously this is not a plan that's current. I'll then write in the hours that they did, right? So if I realize that I have an athlete that might add a bunch of hours, or maybe I have an athlete that misses 1 or 2 workouts every week, that the conversation needs to happen around that at some point, right? So if it's someone that adds hours, is this being detrimental to their training? Are they doing too much? If it's someone that's not doing enough, maybe it just means that the workouts need to be rejigged for them. They have other stuff going on in their lives, right? So how closely do the actual planned hours line up to the done hours? I put TSS in here. I'm not going to say I don't use TSS, but I don't give it as much weight as it looks like on this plan. I do keep track of how many kilometers they do in a week, a month, a year. And then what I do put weight on is their work in kilojoules, because that will actually tell me how much energy they actually use that week. But you could maybe argue that TSS and kilojoules and IF and all those other terms you can use them any way that makes sense to you. But I do keep track of kilojoules. And again, I work a lot with U23s that if they're not getting enough fueling in, then it's noticeable, right? It changes our whole week the next week. And I give them, depending on the year, they get some really hard weeks in here. Like we've had 21,000 kilojoule weeks in some of these athletes. So if they're not aware of that and consciously putting the food back in, then it's a big problem that'll hurt them. It'll hurt their performance. So I do monitor that. The other thing that I kind of monitor is I will monthly just sort of do a recap of what their bests are for the different. I haven't filled this one in because the year hasn't started. But I do keep track every month of where are we sitting in terms of their 5 second, their 1 minute, their 5 minute. You might keep track of this in a graph if you're a graph person. You might have a chart. You might just look on Training Peaks. There's all kinds of different ways to do this. I like having everything in one spot so I can quickly see it. I don't have to jump between documents. I don't have to jump between apps. I can see it all in one place. And that's not to say that I'm looking for these numbers to go up every month, because I'm not. So depending on the phase that we're in, I will expect some numbers to go up and maybe others to stay stagnant or decrease. So again, wintertime, I'm not looking for a super strong 90-minute power, because I'm not going to ask someone to sit on a trainer for 2 hours and just go hard for that whole time. But if it's an anaerobic phase that we're in, then I would like to see those 5 second and 1 minute numbers go up, right? So this basically just helps me stay on target of, is the training that we're doing working for what we're trying to accomplish in that month or that phase. My phases don't always line up per month. But yeah, this just kind of keeps me on target and keeps me going in the right direction. Yeah, I think that's all I had prepared for you. So I will end with it. Well, we'll end with questions, but there's lots of different ways to do a yearly plan. Oh, I should have brought up the one from the coaching courses that you do. So in the coaching courses, they have this whole section, right, where it's like you want to put in how much time you're spending at whatever phase, right? So you might have an 8-hour work week and you might have 6 hours are endurance and 15 minutes is zone 9 and 8 minutes is zone 3. So you'll see some yearly plans that are kind of written that way, where it's like, these are the number of hours and this is how much time I want to spend at each effort. I just find it's easier to write in the workout. Right? So I know these are the workouts that I want to do. And then again, I've been doing this for eons. So I know that I have the right balance of volume and intensity and rest. If you're a newer coach, I would encourage you to spend more time on that part, right? So make sure that if it's, just call me, but go back to your coaching courses or reach out to someone who can help and just double check, right? If you're unsure, there's lots of people out there to help you. So I do think that the way the course is taught, where it teaches you to be mindful of how much time you're spending in each zone. I also don't use zones, but that's fine. But whatever effort you use in each zone, it is important that that stuff is all balanced. And how you choose to keep track of that, there's so many different ways, right? So whether that's writing out each workout for the week and then doing the math and making sure that it lines up, or having a section on your yearly plan that just makes sure that you've accounted for all of that stuff, right? So you don't want to spend, if you're doing 8 hours, you don't want to spend 7 of those hours at 90% or higher effort, right? It's not feasible as an example, but you do need some effort in there. But yeah. So I will end with this. I sent out an email. We'll be starting a mentorship program for those who are interested. So if you would like to be a mentor or a mentee or both, just reach out to me, because there's lots of people out there to help. And one of the things I've realized is coaching is very isolating and very lonely, right? If your day's like mine, I'm for the most part sitting at my computer going over documents like this one, versus those who are lucky enough to go to the track every day. Heaven. but yeah, there's lots of people out here to help, and it's not something that you're doing alone. And there's lots of people with lots of information to share. So yeah, we're going to try and work on setting stuff up to share more information throughout the community. So yeah, reach out. But that's all I got. Any questions? Have I blown any brains? Some of this was over current knowledge. Some of this was under current knowledge, I think.
I know what purple rose are now.
It's between a scientific term for.
I thought you said rose like the flower. So I was thinking, what's the purple rose flower?
Nice. They are kind of like purple roses, though. They have a petal. Each petal matters. Yeah.
But I like the purple rose.
Mm-hmm.
And I like the focus on the happy stuffs.
Happy stuff is huge. And the every year, I give myself something that I think all of my athletes need to work on. Or to implement into training, and we'll see if it works or not. And one of the things this year for my athletes that ride full time, right? So eating is their job, sleeping is their job, cycling is their job, travel is their job, thinking about them all the time is their job. One of the things we're going to implement this year is I'm calling it human time, and we're starting with 1 day a month, and it's just planning something that is outside of their routine, right? Maybe it's a concert, maybe it's a festival, maybe it's a museum, maybe it's playing tourists in a different city. But yeah, we'll see. We'll see if that helps. Just kind of break up the monotony and the stress of what it's like to be a full-time athlete.
It will help
If they do it.
if they do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I back this
I
idea.
also,
I can
go
think
ahead,
about it.
Leanne.
I was reminded of my teammate, and she called them happiness watts, and I called them that too. They can have burger Sundays, all kinds of fun things.
Oh, that was Mara.
Mhm. I had a question about your hours. So, say like once you determine your yearly hour goal, then how do you determine how to program your months with the hours?
It's a good one. Yeah. So going back to this, right? So we've decided, and I was aiming for 10%, right? So in this case, in this athlete, I was aiming for a 10% increase. The true answer is I built this off of a marathon running program, right? So I'll kind of start at the beginning of the year. But it builds exactly like the volume would for a marathon, right? So in this case, we're starting with a 14-hour week, and then we've just added 2 weeks. We've taken some of that time off on the recovery. And then we started at 16 instead of 14, added 2 hours per week. Yeah. And then kind of when we get to December, this person's been riding forever, right? So I'm like, okay, we can now start at an 18-hour week instead of a 16-hour week, and we're going to build up to 21. That could probably also be a 22. And then back down for the recovery week. And then when the weather gets better, in this case, this athlete will be based in Europe somewhere. So February will not be cold and snowy, which I do think needs to be factored in, right? So if you're coaching athletes in Alberta, that's not to say you can't have an 18-hour week. Again, this is a U23 athlete, but maybe this is part skiing and part trainer and part running and part something else, right? Gym. So be mindful that even though these hours are written this way, that doesn't mean this is 20 hours of riding necessarily, right? In the case of this athlete, it is. But yeah, for my athletes that are going to be based in Alberta in February, they're not getting 20 hours of riding. It's just silly. Especially when you can accomplish the same thing through skiing or snowshoeing or snow golf, or I have all kinds of other things you can do outside. But yeah, so then we built it up. So you can sort of see the pattern a little bit when you look at it, that, okay, the recovery weeks come down, and then I might start, in this case, we started back where we were before, or I might up it because I know the athlete will be ready for it. And then in this case, they build up to 24 hours because that's what they did the previous year. Yeah. Does that kind of answer that, Leah?
Yeah, I think that's helpful knowing you're building off another plan or from another sport. And
Yeah,
the recovery weeks, I assume you're backing off like both volume and intensity.
correct.
Not completely, but just less of it.
Yeah. The exception would be this off week. I did put 5 hours in there. Sometimes it's 0. Like I really want them off the bike. I know they're going to be broken. But you have to factor in the mental part too, right? Maybe they can only handle 3 days off the bike and then they go insane because they think they're just losing, right?
Mhm.
So it's managing that mental expectation and confidence with physically what you think they need to be doing. But yeah. And then if you look at the way that the hours actually play out, right? Like if you look at the rows below, you can see it's not linear like the way I've planned it. And I know it's not going to be linear like I've planned it, but it gives me a guideline to work towards that helps me kind of stay on target for a 10% increase.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. But I know like a training camp week, well, I did put 24 hours. It could be 30 hours, right? Depending on the team they're on. If this athlete did a stage race, like the women's tour this year was 27 hours. So yeah, knowing once the race season comes, some of these hours might decrease. The volume or the intensity will increase though, and some of them might increase. Yeah. So, but I think starting with a plan so that you know where you want to get to is the important takeaway. Even though, like, even if you look at what I've tracked already this year, it's nothing like what I planned. Right? It's a little bit all over, but yeah. Yeah, the takeaway is that you have a plan so that you're not forgetting anything. And more importantly, that you're factoring in building, right? Like you can't go from, well, you could, but going from an athlete who might do 8 hours a week, 8 hours a week, 8 hours a week, and then all of a sudden upping them to 18 hours a week because you're like, oh, a junior should be training 18 hours a week. They shouldn't, by the way. At least not all the time. But that's a big jump. You've missed steps, and that's how they'll either get injured or sick or burnt out or hate the sport or not even make it to the race season, right? So the takeaway is that there's a conscious effort that where you want them to be has a plan, a gradual plan to get them there. And maybe that plan is 2 years instead of 1. Or maybe it's 2 years instead of 4. But yeah, that was a good question. Any other questions?
I think it's really good that you like use it all the time, like pretty much on a weekly basis to do the recording of the monitoring. I think a lot of coaches these days, or maybe not a lot, but some maybe defer to using Training Peaks exclusively, and it Training Peaks is great for all kinds of things, but having like going through that process of making a big annual plan and then going back and referring to it through the way you do with like putting the monitoring back in, I think is pretty awesome. It's great.
The other piece that is super helpful is just talking to your athlete, right? Or reading the comments even, right? So it's like, well, because the data tells you one thing, but the comments and talking to them tell you something different. And it's what I showed you is just part of what I actually do. So I'll color code each week, right? So like if an athlete has some weeks where they're feeling amazing, like we want to be able to repeat that. And then it's also something too where once you've worked with an athlete for a good period of time, like some of them get the February blues, or actually it'd be more like the July blues, right? Where season's half over, they're tired. So if you have a way to sort of monitor those patterns, then you can prepare for it, right? So in that case, okay, maybe we just give this athlete, they take vacation days before we even get to that part of the year, right? We add in an off week, a complete off week, before they get there, or we add in some other things that are going to help prevent that mid-season blahness, right? But yeah, so I'll have colors for all kinds of things that just help me with patterns, right? Even something like where it's I might use gray as a color for the athlete feels like complete garbage, but I want them to be feeling like garbage. And then that shows me too, okay, when do they feel good again? When's their next green? Right? Like, careful with overtraining, everyone. Don't do it unless you have experience. If you don't have experience, ask someone about it, because we don't want any of our athletes to be overtrained. I definitely flirt with it as a coach, but it needs to be monitored really closely.